This is number 96. I'm just checking my microphone there, and this section here I'm going to be talking about Europe and what the future is and what's going to happen in Europe and how does Europe affect the UK. Right, so this is Europe 2015, and the main fact to remember is that we do 50% of our trade with Europe. We do 6.8% of our trade with the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India and China. So you'll probably find that most people I can tell you that most manufacturers in the UK do not want the UK to leave the Eurozone, because the reason why Nissan and Siemens and DuPont and Tata have invested so much money into the UK is because we're part of the European Union, and they've done that because we've got a very flexible labour market, which is really, really good. It's a gateway into a 500 million people market. It is still, right now, Europe is the biggest market in the world today. So we don't want to lose that, but Europe is in a really bad state. It's virtually got 0% growth right now. So we do 50% with our trade with Europe. Right, okay, bit of background here. You must understand that Europe has got two crises. It's got a banking crisis, and it's also got a sovereign debt crisis. What are they? A banking crisis is simply that, particularly countries like Spain, they lent out far too much money, and they brought up they made a lot of bad decisions. And in terms of Spain, they lent a lot of money to the housing market. The housing market crashed, so therefore there was a lot of private debt in Spain. But then that private debt from people then became government debt, because the banking system had to be bailed out by the government, and then a lot of that private debt therefore moved into sovereign debt. At the same time, actually not Spain, but also a lot of countries in Europe were borrowing loads and loads of money from other countries because they could borrow money on the cheap, particularly the Greeks. So they borrowed loads of money at very low rates of interest because they were all part of the same European Union. People were willing to lend the money because they thought that Greek debt was the same as the German debt. Well, the Germans don't want that, obviously, because the Greek debt is not the same as the German debt, and the Greeks have borrowed an awful lot of money. So we've also got a sovereign debt crisis. But the two things are interlinked, and there is a banking crisis in Europe right now, and there's also a sovereign debt crisis. So what happens is the banks lend out less money, that leads to a fall in AD. Okay, that leads to a fall in AD, and we move from NY to NY dash. Okay, banking crisis. So the latest thing in Europe was that 27 banks in Europe failed the banking stress test. However, people think that this is really not correct, that many more banks have really failed, because the banks hold a lot of government debt on their books. And the government's debt may not be that safe. We always think that the government debt is really safe. We've now begun to know that actually government debt isn't always as safe as we thought it was. Now, what happens if that debt goes bad? Then there's another banking crisis going on. Okay, so right now Germany has a public debt is about 9% of GDP, Italy 125%, UK about 9% of GDP, and Greece about 130%. Now what happens is, if your debt becomes bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, then you have to borrow money at higher and higher rates of interest. Now there was a time when the Greeks were borrowing money at about 30%. Now that is clearly unsustainable. If you think about a business, it's unsustainable. Right now they're borrowing money at 6%, which is still really, really, really high. But these countries gradually are getting their yearly budgets back in order. So they haven't got large debts anymore. There are actually two rules. Remember when countries first joined the euro, there were two rules they had to have. They were that their national debt was not allowed to be more than 60% of GDP. Well, that's smashed, okay? And also that their budget deficits were not meant to be more than 3% of GDP. So that in the budget deficit is a year-on-year-on deficit. Now, most countries in Europe are now just below that figure, which is good. However, not in the UK. Our budget deficit is still 6% of GDP, and it's the largest in Europe right now. However, there is a feeling that because the UK economy is doing well, and because our budget deficit has come down, that we're gradually getting on top of our national debt problem. Right, but fundamentally, of course, Europe has got a competitive weakness. And I was reading the other day, and let's get this figure correct, that Europe takes up 25% of the world's GDP, but it accounts for 60% of the welfare payments. I think it was 60%, it may have been higher than that. So Europe is, because of its large welfare system, is not as competitive as it should be. And I'll quickly turn here. We've just been doing some business studies, and I'll do another series of lectures on the manufacturing sector within the UK, but the Boston Consulting Group. And they say the two rising global stars of the world are the USA and Mexico. But the two countries which are holding steady is the UK, or some of the countries which are holding steady is the UK and the Netherlands. They're still doing pretty well. All right, so whenever you look at Europe, we've got this big, massive problem here for banking crisis and also sovereign debt crisis. Okay, this is the second session, number 96 on Europe. Now, in 2012, it looks as if Europe was probably going to be okay because the economic growth rate is 1.2%, and it looked maybe that Europe was trying to turn a bit of a corner. What we have to remember when we look at Europe is that youth unemployment in Spain is 60%. It's almost 60% also in Greece. The rate of unemployment in Greece is 25%. I think it's fairly similar again also in Spain. These countries have major problems, and okay, they're just about now, they've got their budget deficits quite low, but they've still got rising levels of national debt, because even if they get their budget deficits down to zero, the interest payments on that debt are now so big that they're often taking up 3 or 4% of GDP. Anyway, if we move on to 2014, right, it looks as if Europe may be entering a triple dip recession. And the inflation is at 0.4%. And 7 Eurozone countries are forecast to have public debt ratios next year of over 100%. Now that's dangerous, because then you'll be paying back about 3 or 4% in interest payments every year just to service that debt. Okay, so these are the problems in Europe right now. And when we think about this, try and compare this to the UK. The first one is there is a problem of deflation, which is falling prices. Why is that really serious? Is because deflation is caused by a lack of demand, and lack of demand creates unemployment, therefore you've got to spend more money. But also, if you have deflation, your real debt burden becomes even bigger. So you have to pay the value of that money becomes worth more. So if you're heavily in debt, then it becomes a major issue. If we compare this to the UK, for example, well, the UK's inflation rate is now about 1%. Right, so that's pretty serious, but at least it's slightly harder than obviously 0.4%, but at least our wage growth is higher than the inflation rate for the first time for about 5 or 6 years. So therefore we would expect consumption to rise. This isn't necessarily happening in Europe. So that's one big issue. The last thing you want is deflation when there are loads of private debt or government debt going around the system. The best way to get out of debt is to create growth. There are now fears of a triple dip recession. Okay, so we haven't got any growth. So therefore what happens is, normally, if we look at a graph on here, and this is time, and let's take the UK. So the UK is, say, £1.5 trillion worth of debt. If we keep the debt at that level, the UK economy, you say, is worth 1.6 trillion. Okay, but if we can continue to get growth, then eventually national debt as a percentage of GDP will fall. Even better than that, I think by the year, is it 2018, 19, it keeps on changing, is that George Osborne believes we'll have a budget surplus. So then, if you have a budget surplus, then it's still on camera. Okay, that's why I'm cutting that down a bit. We may actually pay off some of the debt, and if we continue to get growth, the national debt will fall as a percentage of GDP. Right now, it's about 90%. So here we're looking at maybe 60%. Okay, so that's how you get rid of your debt. You can create growth, but it's almost like there's a massive drag back on European growth as a sovereign and national debt problem, the banking crisis. Okay, the next one is that there is very slow decision making in Europe. They've got all these countries joined up together, and Germany doesn't want to print loads of money to get Europe out of their current crisis. Compare that to the UK. That's what we did do. So that helped us through that particular point in time. There is a banking crisis, which I've just been speaking about, and if banks don't lend out money, that will also lead to a fall in AD. The governments in Europe have to sell to finance their debt by selling more bonds, and by selling more bonds, they may be charged a higher rate of interest on those bonds. So when you look at Europe right now, particularly in the year 2015, there's going to be huge problems, underlying problems, that's going to make it very hard to grow. Now, in terms of the AQA syllabus, they're interested in how does Europe affect the UK. So they're likely to ask some questions on, well, how does it affect the UK? So they'll give you a scenario. If Europe does this, will this help the UK? Okay, right. Thank you very much. That's you. Okay, so here we are looking once again at Europe, and the questions on Europe the questions on Europe in terms of the AQA paper for this year and also next year is that it tends to be, well, if this happens in Europe, how will this affect the UK? Right, the last question that was actually asked, should the UK leave Europe? And previous questions have been, should we allow Turkey to join Europe? What will be the effect of that in the UK? What will be the effect of Europe balancing its budgets? How will that impact upon the UK? What will be the effect of Europe following a fiscal stimulus? What will be the effect of Europe of deflation in Europe? What will be the effect of Europe printing more money? Now, really, with a lot of these questions, you have to make some assumptions here, because you could argue with all of these that if any of these four things happened here, one or any of these three things happen, one thing that could happen is that could then lead to an increase in demand in Europe. And if there was an increase in demand in Europe, then they would demand more exports from the UK. So therefore, there's one very simple paragraph that we can always use. The UK wants more exports because it wants export-led growth. If we get more exports, export-led multiplier, multiplier accelerator, and everything like that. So if you can keep that in the back of your mind. So even if you decrease G, well, maybe that's a good thing if you decrease G, because then maybe Europe will eventually then decrease taxes, and then maybe that will lead to a rise in demand in Europe. So maybe we'll be able to sell them more exports. However, maybe decreasing G is a bad idea, because decreasing G leads to a fall in AD via the multiplier accelerator. So as a candidate, you have to make those assumptions. Right. Okay, when you think about Europe, you think about the sovereign debt crisis and the banking crisis that exists in Europe. And that is fundamental to what Europe is in. And I've just spoken about that in a previous lecture on number 96, is that the banking crisis was caused by banks lending out too much money, but then the government had to take over those banking debts. But the banks then have a lot of government debt on their books. So this creates a very dangerous situation. So you've got two different crises going on there. Also, because we are part of Europe, the UK has become a favourite destination for foreign direct investment. And if you believe the Boston Consulting Group report that just came out last year, what they said was that the UK should be able to hold its own in the new global market, unlike the rest of Europe, because it's quite a dynamic economy. So it's got good supply side in here. So, but if we did leave Europe or in any way, then we're likely to see less foreign direct investment coming into Europe. In terms of national debt, should we increase G or decrease G? And I think at the moment there's some plan to go through to have a 350 million boost, £350 million boost for the whole of Europe. But the £350 million boost, when your economy is roughly, I don't know how big it is actually, but I'm just guessing maybe it's $6 trillion. Is that going to make a huge difference in terms of Europe? But you could argue it could. That could then lead to an increase in AD, and it could create multiple accelerator effects. Therefore, we increase exports, etc. But basically, fundamentally, Europe needs complete structural reform. That's what the Germans want. So there's also supply side issues. The welfare payments are far too high. They can't compete on a global basis. So really, it's a competitiveness problem. And this is really the key problem in Europe right now. And then the question arises, well, okay, if Europe's a little bit stuffed, shouldn't the UK be focusing on the BRIC countries and the MINT countries? The MINT standing for Malaysia, Indonesia, Nigeria and Turkey. Shouldn't we be focusing on them rather than Europe? Well, probably we should do. But then we've got to look at those mega trends that we've also spoken about in the manufacturing part of my YouTube collection. On there's lots of big innovative trends out there, and if the UK can take advantage of these, then it can sell more to these countries. But at the moment, these countries are not big enough to take up all of our exports. But in the future, the UK will no doubt move us in that direction. Finally, companies want us to stay in Europe. So therefore we shouldn't really leave, because Nissan, DuPont, Siemens, they all want us in Europe because that's a pretty big marketplace. So whenever you get a question, a European question, it's always going to be, how does this affect the UK? Now, I always say to my students, well, you can always talk about exports. You can normally talk about foreign direct investment. And will investment continue? Because if Europe crashes, will the UK continue to get loads of foreign direct investment? You may well be able to talk about the sovereign debt crisis, and then you've got 3 paragraphs within your essay already, and then these other issues surrounding Europe as well. So hopefully in these lectures you've got an idea about where Europe is at and why Europe is important to us, because fundamentally, of course, we export 50% of our goods to Europe and only 6.8% to the BRIC countries. Thank you.